two analogies I've thought of to try to explain the shift are the following. In one way, it feels like on a quantum level, a tiny thing changes, and then everything is different in kind of a tiny way, which results in everything being completely different. But also, in nothing in relation to one another having really changed. It kind of also makes me think of Star Trek phase shift situations where everything is the same, but it's also completely different. And the other analogy that I find better, I guess, because I can just kind of speak about it more and it just feels better, is having gained a dimension. One thing that makes a lot of sense to me now is people saying that the thoughts, for example, are like little birds. They can be there, they don't affect the Tao, I guess, is a really good expression for that. An expression, a word that isn't used for other things. So the thoughts can trigger the feelings and vice versa, and they can do stuff in the body, but it doesn't affect. For example, the action that would be taken in any kind of causal, direct manner, the way that it definitely used to. And the image that I really like the image with the birds as well. But for the analogy I'm trying to make, it's kind of like you have a surface, a water surface, and then there's lots of lights reflecting on that. And that's the thoughts. And they have their, as Michael Taft uses the expression in a bit of a different way, but the fabulous display of this light, kind of. This is not what Michael Taft actually is talking about, but I like his expression of the fabulosity of this display. He talks about the ground of being dancing itself into existence, which is of course related to what I'm trying to say, but not directly. So anyways, we have a surface of water, I and who might be listening in our shared space, and the thoughts are lights reflecting on that. And as we know, the light doesn't affect the movement of the water, or perhaps the stillness, rather, of the water. But if you're a two-dimensional being living on the surface, meaning that you are not the body of water, you are on the surface, then those lights are literal obstacles to you. The shapes they project onto your surface are literal, or are actual things for you to evade, to affect you, to harm you, to invigorate, or to support you, to just plainly affect you very directly. So when the shining core that all of us have, which is what is free when one is awake, when that is still encrusted with, no matter how thin a layer of the thought and feeling world, the thought and feeling plane that contains it, which is where we react from and what limits us in that kind of way, or that's at least how I experienced it, as a limitation. And from early childhood, I was always kind of trying to pick away at by ways of reconditioning, of just learning a lot, knowing things, hoping that by knowing that, something would change about the fundamental way I am. But when we're living from that perspective, when we're living as that thought and feeling plane or crust or whatever, that's the two-dimensional life that I'm talking about. And I'm not trying to talk about superiority or inferiority. I'm not saying that the three-dimensional life that this shift has given me is what everyone should do. I'm saying that for me, it's improved things. And by gaining that third dimension, depth, which fits nicely with the water analogy, you go down into the water and then become this whole volume, this entire body of water, which is of course not affected by those shining lights on top of it. Because when you have a third dimension, something that seems like an obstacle on the surface, that as a 2D creature you can't avoid, you have to change yourself, your plan, you have to change your movement to deal with. With the third dimension, it's very obvious that that is not necessary, because within the third dimension you can easily just evade it, or not even evade like it's something bad that needs to be kind of gotten out of the way of, but just in terms of that it's not even anything that needs to be reacted to, that needs to decide anything. It just doesn't have that power anymore. In a way, it's two different ways of saying the quantum shift analogy, and then the water surface gaining third dimension analogy. Both kind of describe different types of alienness that are actually also the same, because the important thing is the alienness, not the way it is gotten to, or as in gotten to with words, or described, pointed at. Because both of those things, by definition, are unimaginable from the perspective that hasn't shifted. You can't imagine what, it's so vastly complex. You can't imagine what the universe would be like if a little tiny quantum thing would be different. just to, without any significance, make some kind of specific pointer. If the way electrons did their thing, assuming electrons exist in that way, if there was something a bit different about that, it would affect everything. But assuming that it would be different in a way that still makes different levels of complexity, things working together, systems being created possible, it would also make sense within that system. It would make sense completely, the way that the cohesion of our world, is perfect. It makes sense in that way. So that kind of quantum difference is something that cannot be pictured. It just completely goes beyond our capacity to think, to imagine, to hold. And the same goes for the dimensional analogy. Actually picturing what it would be like if you had another dimension available in your reality, viewing it from your reality that does not have that dimension, that's by definition not possible. I'm not saying that attempts at that can't be made, and that those attempts might be gesturing in their tiny way correctly. It's impossible to understand the implications of a change that is so fundamental from a place that has to even try to understand. Because when you have that dimension, when that shift has happened, when that most fundamental change, yet sameness, yet because it's so natural, the sameness, it's just as natural and self-contained as the sameness before. When that has happened, it makes sense. And disregarding how this sentence was started, it cannot be projected, conceived of, constructed within that plane of thought. Because when it's not experiential, that's the only resource you have to imagine something like that, to imagine it, to image it, to pretend it with your thoughts, which by definition are the thing that will be completely changed, or your view on them will be completely changed. You can't see the lens as Zubin, Z-Dog MD, says in his interview with Suzanne Chang, says very nicely, you can't see it because you are seeing as it. So by definition, it's a thing that cannot be conceived of. Period. But also cannot be conceived of before the shift happens. And the first sentence that I just said about it cannot be conceived of in general is more true, because whatever has shifted now, whatever my experience includes or pervades that my experience before did not, is not being conceived or understood by me. It just is.